Thanks very much, Bruno. I'm honored to be here. What I'm going to do is introduce digital methods. And the argument that I'm going to make is that digital methods is a new era in internet-related research. So by way of introduction, I'd like to take us briefly through how we used to do research with the internet and how arguably we're all doing it now. Initially, way back when, during the special cyberspace period, where the internet was associated with all things cyber, we had the special issue with the internet as it's being distinct from the real. So we conducted a lot of what you might call virtual studies. And the idea that the internet was distinct from the real, you could see in any number of different pronouncements about the independence of cyberspace by particular cyberspace gurus. You could see it in the work of any number of different researchers who sought to think of all the different kinds of ways in which our minds would be expanded, how a cyberspace would be a new mind world. In any case, it was very, very different from anything that we would call real. And a lot of these ideas, of course, were inspired by a lot of the ideas surrounding virtual reality. So the internet came of age during this period of virtual reality and cyberspace, and it took a long time to disconnect internet-related research from this idea that it's a virtual world apart from the real. But something happened about 1998 approximately, and that was this book that was written by a guy by the name of Steve Jones. I believe it was called Doing Internet Research. And he, for the first time, not necessarily he alone, but around that period, for the first time, was the introduction of the word method. What kinds of methods are there for internet-related research? Enter the social scientists. In particular, the program by the Virtual Society program run by Steve Woolgar in Britain, in particular, any number of different ethnographic studies where the researchers went to the ground. Right? So they went to the internet cafes. They looked over shoulders of users. And they interviewed, they surveyed, and they observed. And what they did was that they grounded the virtual. So in order to understand the online world, you needed to actually to go to the ground. You actually needed to go to the real. Yeah? So internet research changed around that period of time. And some of the interesting findings from that period we're now all very familiar with. Around that time was the introduction of the term digital divide. So not all people inhabiting cyberspace actually experience it the same way. There are different levels of online access. There are different levels of skills, yeah? The digital divide. Equally, what some of the researchers found, and we all know this now, that the more you interact online, the more you're liable to have real-world interactions. Yeah? So the virtual doesn't substitute for the real, rather it complements it. Things like this. Now, these particular ideas are now quite solid. All the methods that have been developed, the transference of methods from the social scientific instrumentarium onto the web, it's a project that is ongoing, and it is, in some sense, summed up in the term virtual methods. So if you look up this particular idea, there's now a book out. It's been out for a few years now, edited by Christine Hine. It's become a term. Yeah? It's the transference, the one-to-one transference, if you will, of methods onto the web. Yeah? I would like to argue that we're now moving into a new era of internet-related research. And what I will argue is that this era of internet research is in its infancy, but we can see it if we look a lot outside of social science in particular. And I'll go through that for you in a minute. But what I would like to introduce to you is the idea that the notion of the virtual is now, in some sense, dead. Or that the virtual is no longer necessarily a very useful term, or cyberspace is not necessarily a very useful term. Rather, the web, in some sense, is continually being used as a data set. As a data set where we can get indications of what's going on in society. So for the third era of internet research, I'm using a term currently, and I call it online groundedness. So we ground findings about society and culture based on online data. Yeah? So we are no longer thinking of the online as a virtual space that is something apart from the real. And we're no longer thinking of online culture as something that we should study in and of itself only, as a special category of research, online studies. No, what we're doing increasingly is we're using the online data to make claims about what's going on in the real. We're grounding our findings in the online. And we call this online groundedness. Let me just take you immediately to a very, very classic example, and it also introduces any number of the different difficulties. This is Google Flu Trends. You will have heard of it. What Google, and this is a google.org project, and what Google is doing is they are taking queries for flu and flu-related symptoms and geolocating where those queries come from in order to provide ideas about where flu is at. Now, it's interesting, when this particular project first was launched, what people were talking about was the internet knows where flu is. Yeah? And it knows it, at least through these techniques and through Google, and it knows it prior to the normal way of coming to know where flu is. That is to say, the data collection methods from hospitals, emergency rooms, etc., that then get fed to, in this case, in the US, the Center for Disease Control. Yeah? So Google, with this flu trends, arguably, and there is a big debate about it, is anticipating by anywhere between 5 and 7 days where flu is at. Yeah? And what I find interesting about this particular piece of work is it opens up not only the question of grounding claims about what's going on in society online, but it also opens up questions, the tricky question of the baseline. So normally the baseline is always the ground. So there might be some indications with online data that perhaps we know in advance, we can anticipate where flu is going to be, but in fact, in order to really, really know, we have to go back to the ground. Yeah? And it's this interesting idea of where the ground now is that I'd like to explore a little bit further today. So the ground arguably is shifting. The baseline is shifting, or at least the baseline is becoming this new question. Right? Where do you go after an interview? You probably, oftentimes, go and then look the person up online. So you're checking, your reality checking, arguably, oftentimes occurs in the online environment instead of on the ground. Yeah? I just want to give you an example of this. I came up with this term, online groundedness, when I read a study that was done by some investigative reporters at a newspaper in the Netherlands called the NRC Handelsblad. And what the reporters did, what their research question was is the Netherlands as a culture, is it hardening? That is to say, is there more hate? And they operationalize this question by looking at two kinds of actors, the right-wing actors and the extremist right-wing actors. And they were interested in whether or not the language of the right was increasingly becoming similar to the language of the extremists. Now, in order to find out the answer to this,